Welcome to episode 92 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today we get to speak to retired agent Stewart Fillmore, who served with the FBI for 29 years. He began his bureau career as a support employee and after 3 years received an appointment to the special agent position. He was assigned to the Dallas, Little Rock, Chicago, and Tyler, Texas offices. A career street agent, Stewart Fillmore worked most of the criminal investigations under the jurisdiction of the FBI. However, his primary specialty was investigating public corruption. In this episode, Stewart Fillmore reviews a case initiated based on allegations that minority motorists were being illegally stopped on an isolated stretch of highway in rural East Texas. The case eventually was redirected to determine how and by whom drugs and firearms confiscated from motorists had gone missing from the local police evidence room. Stewart Fillmore wrote a book about the case, Tenaha, Corruption and Cover-Up in Small Town Texas. The true crime story provides an inside look at how an actual FBI public corruption investigation is worked. Since retiring from the FBI, Fillmore currently operates his own private investigation company. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. There are so many twists and turns that you are going to say to yourself, this has got to be fiction, especially when it comes to the surprised and unexpected ending. Before we get to the case, I just have a few things. First of all, for those of you who listen to the podcast on iTunes or a podcast app that feeds directly from Apple Podcast, I want to let you know that I've been working on the audio files to make them compliant with the new iOS 11 tags and metadata requirements. In doing so, I discovered that there were about 8 of my earlier audio files, because of some error, weren't even listed in iTunes and the other apps. So I do want to let you know about that because I don't want you to have missed out on those great episodes, especially if you've come to the podcast recently and have been binging from the beginning. So I want you to look out for episodes 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 16, 18, and 19. I don't know when they disappeared, but they're back and they're great, and they feature drugs and the Sicilian mob, espionage, extraterritorial jurisdiction, a serial killer in Ghana, the Japanese Legat, the Jihad Jane terrorism case, the Chasing Phil bogus security case, and a case involving the murder of 3 little girls in Dallas. So again, episodes 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 16, 18, and 19 should have shown up in your new episode feed, but if they haven't and you've missed them, I hope you go back and listen to them. The only other 2 things I have to remind you is that I am running a special November giveaway, and all you need to do to enter that giveaway is to be a member of my reader team. If you're not yet a member of my reader team, you can join by going to my website, jerrywilliams.com, and sign up when you see the pop-up, or my Facebook page, Jerry Williams Author, and signing up to be a member of my reader team there. What I'm giving away is a special limited edition FBI collectible ornament that you can't get anywhere else except for the FBI Recreation Association store down in Washington, D.C., and from me. So 3 lucky winners will be selected on December the 1st. After you've signed up to be a member of my reader team, I will send you my November reader team email about the FBI and books, TV, and movies, and that will explain everything you need to know in order to enter to win that limited edition FBI ornament. This month's email is all about the FBI Experience, which is the new FBI tour at FBI headquarters. You'll learn about what you need to do in order to visit the FBI Experience and that FBI Recreation Association store. I also want to ask for your help. Unfortunately, my special guest that I was hoping to have for the 100th anniversary has declined. I've wiped away the tears, very disappointed, but we're going to still have a great 100th episode talking once again about the FBI and books, TV, and movies, and looking at cliches and misconceptions. So we did 10 for the 50th episode. We'll do 10 more for the 100th episode. I've started collecting some. If you have some things that you've seen on different shows or in different books about the FBI and you really question about whether or not they're accurate, please let me know. Email me at jerrywilliamsauthor@gmail.com, tweet me at jerrywilliams1, or message me on my author Facebook page, Jerry Williams Author. Please stick around after the interview. I have a great crime fiction recommendation. But for now, here's the show. I am excited to introduce my guest for today, Stewart Fillmore. Hi, Stewart. How are you?
I'm great, Jerry. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I am so glad that I was able to connect with you because I saw an article about a book that you wrote, a true crime book that you wrote, and as I was reading over, what it was all about, I thought, I got to get this guy on the podcast.
That's great.
Yeah, and so the name of your book is Tenaha, Corruption and Cover-Up in a Small Texas Town. Give us just a really quick tease about what the case is about, and then we'll go right in and you can tell us all the twists and turns and details.
It started with a large national media attention that was brought about that the local police in this small Texas town were stopping minority motorists driving through there and using the power of their law enforcement authority were extorting money and possessions and cars. And there was a big splash in the media about it, and that's how it started. But as we worked the case, we found out there was a lot more to it, and the rest of the story was not told.
Well, that sounds pretty scary on itself. If you are, an African-American or Hispanic individual driving through this area and you get pulled over, that sounds, for no reason, that sounds very frightening. But you're telling me that wasn't even the case? I mean, that sounds like something, a civil rights violation or whatever, that the FBI could investigate.
Well, the investigation started as a civil rights case, and you're absolutely right. Those initial allegations were scary, and it was certainly appropriate for the FBI to be involved in that investigation.
But you're saying nothing really happened with that?
Well, the case was worked very thoroughly and over a course of about 18 months, the civil rights investigation. But at the end of that investigation, and we looked at bank records, we looked at videos of the car stops, we interviewed the alleged victims, numerous witnesses involved. It just wasn't there. The stops we found were appropriate. They had been documented, and what really kind of became apparent was that, or they gave it such a bad appearance, was that the DA in that small Texas county had not prosecuted any of these cases. So there were hundreds of car stops, and both drugs and money were seized, but the DA had not prosecuted anyone for either the drug possession or having large amounts of cash that they couldn't account for. So it just had the appearance that they were just simply just stealing people's money and that there was no judicial process to back it up. And so it gave a really horrible appearance. But at the end of that investigation, there were the stops and the videos that we reviewed appeared to be appropriate and legitimate. And in tracing all the money, there weren't any inappropriate payments. In other words, no one had personally profited. None of the police involved, the DA, and so forth. There were a few questionable transactions involving the money, but it would not have fallen as it had gone into someone's pocket personally. So really that case, that was pretty much how the civil rights portion of that case ended. So toward the end of that case, as we were really kind of just wrapping it up, I received a letter from the city marshal of Tenaha, Texas, which is a small town in deep East Texas of about 1,000 people. And it sits strategically on Highway 59, which happens to be one of the major drug trafficking corridors out of Houston that leads to points north. And it's been known for years that Highway 59 is a drug highway. And so that's why Tenaha was strategically placed. And the local police there had started doing drug interdiction. And they had hired, the city had hired a retired DPS trooper named Barry Washington. And Barry Washington was legendary at narcotics interdiction, which is a law enforcement technique that when people are stopped, motorists are stopped, that the officer will look for indicators of drug trafficking. And Barry Washington was expert at it. He during his career in the highway patrol, he had seized, I can't even tell you how many thousands of pounds of drugs that he had seized over the years. So he was very good at this technique of interdiction. And so it began, once he was hired in Tenaha, it began. And he had been there about a year when allegations started surfacing that motorists were just being stopped, primarily minorities, and that they were having their money seized with a threat of either going to jail, and in some cases people's children, they were threatened that their children were going to be taken away from them. But through the course of this investigation, we really found that although the allegations sounded egregious, that they really didn't have the merit, and it was just something that ultimately we just couldn't find the evidence for. So it's important to realize that, sometimes crimes do occur, but if we don't have the evidence for it and we can't prove it in court, then we don't, pursue these to try to continue to put someone in jail if we can't prove it. So I'm not saying that something that maybe some violations didn't occur, but I'm saying we never found it in a very thorough investigation, anything that we could have proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court. So as that case was ramping up, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How large is Tenaha? I mean, how many people live in this area? I just want to get a picture of, the city or the town that surrounds this Highway 59.
Yeah. Okay. So Tenaha it's about 1,000 people in a small town. The downtown portion of Tenaha, which runs parallel to Highway 59, has definitely seen its better days. I think most of the buildings are probably in the neighborhood of 100 years old or older. Very few businesses are still there. They have a brand new football stadium though that's very nice. And it's a quiet country town for folks that aren't familiar with the geography of Texas. East Texas is very heavily wooded with rolling sand hills, and it's really a pretty place in that it's wooded and rural and just a quiet country town.
So you have a small town like this. Why are they invested in these drug interdictions? I mean, pulling people off of the highway. What are they going to get out of it that they can't leave to a larger city or the Texas Rangers to do? Why would they want to spend so much of their manpower, resources, and energy pulling over drivers?
And that gets into, I guess, a larger debate or a separate debate about how small towns earn their revenue. Okay, so Barry Washington was hired to just conduct interdiction in the town, and once these seizures started, the town coffers really started filling up. Okay, the seized money really went to the different purposes. So let me explain that. So in Texas, when money is seized in a criminal case, it can be used. That money can be used for law enforcement purposes only. Okay, that is new cars, new equipment, and so forth. So with that seizure money available to the city didn't have to come up with its own funding for law enforcement gear, and that also the DA's office could use that money as well. As long as it was strictly for a law enforcement purpose. And that was one thing that got into a little of a sticky issue, because the DA did use some of the seizure money for electioneering. So it was questionable whether that would fall under a law enforcement purpose or not, but that really didn't rise to a criminal violation at the end of that case as we looked at it. So that was the primary purpose, was just to add additional funding to the city. And people can argue whether that's right or wrong, but that was the purpose of it.
All right, I just had those initial questions, but
I want you to get the full picture, because it's really a fascinating story.
So you're at the point now where you've looked into the civil rights investigation, and you're not finding the evidence that you need to prove that there was actual criminal activity. So is that it? It's over?
That's correct. That's correct. Well, one would think so. I mean, at this point, I was pretty much of the mindset that this is over, and was just doing some follow-up work to get ready to close this out, when I received a letter from the city marshal of Tenaha, whose name was Fred Walker. And Fred, I had interviewed him a couple times officially during the civil rights investigation, and had spoken to him informally a handful of other times. So I wasn't necessarily surprised to see anything from Fred, but so I just assumed it was a routine letter. So when I opened it, within, I don't know, a couple of sentences, I realized what I was reading was an extortion letter. It was a 2-page letter, and there were actually 2 copies of this same letter. One was addressed to Fred Walker, the city marshal, and one was addressed to an individual named Rod McClure, who I was not familiar with. So as I read the letter, it was from a person that called themselves Jack Frost. Jack Frost claimed to be a DEA agent, and that he, in the course of his job as a DEA agent, had become aware that Fred Walker and Rod McClure had been stealing narcotics evidence from the city marshal's evidence room, selling it and making a huge profit. Well, all Jack Frost wanted in return for his silence or inaction was $71,000 in cash from Walker and McClure. He provided an email address, and he provided a post office box in Round Rock, Texas, which is down near Austin, Texas. And for folks not familiar with Texas, that's about 4 hours south of Dallas. So Frost gave a short deadline for when he wanted this cash in this mailbox, and he, on one of the letters, he even provided a key to the mailbox and taped an original key on it. And then he wanted to be notified at the email address that he provided when the money was in there. Otherwise, I think the quote was, he was going to burn the both of you down. So by the time I got this letter, Jack Frost's deadline had already passed. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact deadline, but it was a very short deadline. By the time I got it, it had passed. So I immediately called Fred Walker. And Fred, I questioned him, what is this about? What tell me what you know. And he said, I don't know anything. I said, who is Rod McClure? He said, well, he's a guy just here in town. He owns a computer shop. But he said, I have no idea why he would get this letter. He said, I don't know what this is about. So at this point, I had no reason to distrust Fred Walker or to not believe anything that he said. So I took this as real and set about trying to identify this Jack Frost character. And I gave Fred Walker a warning that, hey, you might want to be careful. We don't know who this is or what this is. So, and he agreed.
So
go ahead.
If I can interrupt just for a second.
Sure.
So I take it that Fred Walker sent you the letter because he was fearful. He wanted help from the FBI because he's claiming he doesn't know what the letter was about, but he certainly knew that a threat, that I'm going to burn you guys down, was pretty threatening to his life.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one other question. I'm sorry.
You've actually brought up a very good point, and that will actually make the story more compelling in the end. Okay, well, good. The other thing I wanted to be clear about is the city marshal. That's not a term on the East Coast that I am, aware of. Mm-hmm. Is that like the sheriff's office or a police department? It's essentially a local police department. So you have to understand, this is a city of 1,000 people. At the time, there were two officers in the city marshal's office. There was Fred Walker, who was the city marshal, and Barry Washington, the deputy city marshal. Now, an interesting thing about that was Barry Washington, although he was the deputy city marshal, had been hired directly by the mayor of the town and not by Fred Walker. And Barry Washington reported to the mayor and not Fred Walker. Okay? Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting dynamic. Dynamic and chain of command there. Okay? So another little thing is that Barry Washington was actually making more money than Fred Walker. So there was an interesting dynamic between those two. So town marshal or city marshal, that's just a unique term, and quite honestly, it's a very uncommon usage even in Texas. So I don't know how necessarily Tenaha decided on having a city marshal's office versus having a police department, but nonetheless, that's what that was. So initially, the first thing to do is try to identify who Jack Frost is, where this letter came from, and there were several ways to do that. He had left an email address, he had rented a post office box down in Round Rock, Texas, and so it was actually pretty simple to identify who it was. And his name was Terrence Ford, and that's actually not his real name, because in the book that I wrote, I changed the names of certain witnesses who never became public. This case, in the end, as we'll go through, never actually went to trial. So many of the witnesses that we talked to along the way never became public, and their identities were never publicly known. So I changed the names of any witnesses that weren't made public during the course of the case. So Terrence Ford was identified. He lived in a Dallas suburb. Now, another thing for listeners not necessarily familiar with Texas again, so Tenaha, you have to understand, was in the deep eastern part of the state, almost in Louisiana, very close to Louisiana, probably about 3.5 hours from Dallas. And so I was very curious as to how someone in the Dallas area would know anything about anybody over in Tenaha. So I got phone records for Terrence Ford, and that's when the case really took an interesting turn, because I found thousands of phone calls between Terrence Ford and Rod McClure. Rod McClure, as you recall, was another person who got the letter, this Jack Frost extortion letter. There were also a lesser number of calls, but still a good number, between Terrence Ford and Fred Walker, the city marshal. So it was very curious that it seemed that the extortioner personally knew both McClure and Walker. So it certainly had a curious turn to it, and made me start thinking that, well, I don't know what this is. I don't know, maybe Fred Walker and Rod McClure, maybe they're not victims. I don't know what I'm looking at here. So let me back up for just a quick moment, and that is to say that during the civil rights investigation, there were 2 burglaries that occurred in the city of Tenaha. One was at the city marshal's office, and one was at the county constable's office. in this small town, there were two law enforcement offices. So a county office and then the city office. Both offices were burglarized, which is very unusual that you would have a law enforcement office burglarized. But because at the time we were on the civil rights investigation, it wasn't a matter that had FBI jurisdiction. I didn't look into those, so it was just a curious thing. But then you have this letter from Jack Frost saying that evidence is being stolen out of the city marshal's office, and it occurred to me that of these burglaries, and it made me start thinking, I'm not sure this is exactly what it appears to be. So I had another discussion, or a subsequent discussion, with a new city marshal who had replaced Fred Walker. And when this new city marshal had come in, he had noticed that Fred Walker spent a lot of time with Rod McClure. And actually, it turned out that Rod McClure was a little bit more than just the local computer guy. Apparently, McClure had a long criminal history, and at that time, according to the city marshal, was reputed to be a drug dealer in town. And I thought, well, it sure is curious that Fred Walker is spending so much time with McClure, and if he's reputed to be a drug dealer, and that also kind of makes sense now that maybe why McClure would be getting an extortion letter about drug dealing. So that really kind of turned the case around and made me start thinking this may not be exactly what it appears to be. So after some more investigation to look at bank records, to firm up that actually Terrence Ford was the person that sent this extortion letter, we confronted him in an interview at his home in the Dallas suburbs. And he initially said, he admitted that he had sent the letters, the Jack Frost extortion letters. But he said, well, Fred Walker and Rod McClure are friends of mine. McClure and I go way back. I've known him a long time. And this was just a practical joke. It was a practical joke. And he said, I didn't tell Rod about it because when Rod got the letter, he was scared and actually told me that the letters had been forwarded to the FBI, and Ford said it scared me. So he said I didn't say anything. I didn't want to, I didn't want him to know that I had done it because he was going to be really mad. But based on what I knew at this point, it didn't fit. It was too elaborate for a joke. The cost of setting up this post office box. He had used a person unrelated to this case to actually set up the mailbox, and had actually falsified some identification documents for her to use to open up this account, this mailbox account. So it was far too elaborate to make sense that it was a joke. And so,
did I miss something? How were you able to determine that Terrence Ford was the person who wrote the letter? Was that through the emails also?
Through the email, yes, and so when his friend, the unrelated female, when she opened up the post office box, she had to provide some identification. She provided her driver's license, and she provided 2 insurance cards for automobile liability insurance cards. And those cards had her name on it, but the VIN numbers for the cars that were supposedly insured came back to Terrence Ford. Okay. So that's how I initially got Ford's name. And then when I got the records for the email address, it came back to his address. Okay. So at this point, I didn't know if the female was in on it or not, but I know that through the course of the case that she really wasn't, that she actually had just basically been used by Ford and didn't really know what she was a part of. Anyway, so we confronted Ford. He says it's a joke, but there were several things that were inconsistent with his story. And this is where many times in the FBI, people think that we know more than we do, actually. And I certainly at this point didn't mind using that myth to my advantage, because in the course of this interview, Ford had told me a couple things related to some phone calls that I knew were inconsistent in my review of his records. And I stopped him and I said, okay, first off, I don't believe that this was a joke. It was far too elaborate for you to do this. And I said, you're not telling me the truth. You're not telling, there's something you're not telling me and you know it. And what I meant was this discrepancy in the phone records that we were talking about at the moment. And that's what I meant when I said, you're not telling me everything. And he said, well, you're right. I'm not telling you everything. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't done as a joke. It was a real extortion. And if I tell you any more, I'm gonna get myself in trouble. But I know a lot about some corruption there. And so we got him what's called a proffer, which is for listeners unfamiliar with that, it's called a Queen for a Day session in the FBI, and that is someone is given a proffer letter which allows them to provide information that cannot be used against them, as long as that information is truthful. What they acknowledge or admit to cannot be used against them. It's not necessarily immunity, but it allows them to not have that used against them. So we did a proffer session with Terrence Ford, and he laid out a whole story that he had known McClure going back many years. They had actually been DEA informants together back in the early 90s. And they had maintained contact over the years, and he went to visit McClure over in Tenaha from time to time. And he said that beginning in 2009, McClure had started stealing narcotics out of both the constable's office and out of the city marshal's office, all with the help and assistance of the city marshal, Fred Walker.
Wow.
And that they had been selling these drugs now for several months, and supposedly were making a lot of money. Now, Terrence Ford was an interesting guy. He saw himself as a Hollywood screenwriter and believed he was going to have a career as a screenwriter, and had actually gone out to L.A. to pursue that, but that had not really worked out for him. So he was not doing that great financially, and he kept getting text messages and phone calls from McClure saying how much money he and Walker were making selling these stolen drugs, and it was just easy street. But McClure was wanting to expand and have Ford sell these stolen drugs in the Dallas area and expand their market. Ford resisted that at first, but because his screenwriting efforts had not worked out for him, he eventually decided that he would do that.
A guy has to have a backup plan.
Exactly. You have to have a plan B in life. So he did. He got some marijuana and he got some pills from McClure, and turns out that Ford was actually probably a worse drug dealer than he was a screenwriter. Because on the two occasions that he tried to sell this stolen marijuana, he got ripped off himself and by the people he was trying to sell to. So he was frustrated at this point, and he kept getting text messages or pictures from McClure that showed cash and hundreds of dollars being made, and McClure was bragging about it. So Ford decided that, well, they're making so much cash, it won't hurt them to give up a little bit of it, and he came up with the extortion plan. And one thing that you had mentioned a second ago about that Walker had sent the letter to me and was genuinely scared, as it turns out he was. When he and McClure got these letters, they did believe that this was a real extortion. But why they sent it to the FBI, knowing that it was true, that it can't contain these allegations about the drug trafficking. I'll get to that later, and that's going to be the compelling part. Okay, so over the course of a long career in the FBI, I have interviewed a lot of people, and one thing that I learned over time was most people that are kind of in trouble or on the edge of the law very rarely tell you the truth. So, or there's always shades of the truth. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I always want is independent corroboration. So I'll listen to someone, I'll let them tell me what they know, but I'm also at the same time thinking, how can I prove what they're telling me independently? So at the end of this tale of Ford, I asked him, I said, well, that's a very compelling story and some really blockbuster allegations here, but why? How can I prove that independently? And he said, I've known Rod McClure a long time. He's over the years we've had our ups and downs, and he said one of the things I've learned to do is I need to protect myself in any dealings with Rod McClure. And he pulled out his phone and he showed a series of photographs of what appeared to be marijuana, large amounts of marijuana, pills, and even something that was, the picture described, it was a white powder described as 9 kilos of cocaine. The pictures of the marijuana were taken inside McClure's garage. And so it was pretty compelling evidence, including that not only were there pictures, but also McClure had provided captions with the pictures as to what you were seeing. So in other words, it was the amounts of hydrocodone pills, the amounts of Xanax pills, the amounts of marijuana, and so forth. So he had laid it all out right there. Now, to backtrack just a little bit about the burglary that had occurred. Now, in the city marshal's office, a burglary had occurred in August of 2010, and the entire evidence room had been ransacked, and all narcotics evidence was missing. So one of the things that Ford had revealed was that McClure and Walker had gotten nervous that someone was going to inventory the evidence room at some point and find out that all the evidence was missing because they had steadily been taking it out over time. And what would be the explanation be? So they decided to stage a burglary to cover up this theft of the drugs that had been ongoing. And so McClure and Walker staged this burglary, and that's how they covered it up. And what they left behind were empty boxes where the narcotics had actually been stored. So going back to Barry Washington from the civil rights case a moment, in addition to the seizures that he had made of money, people carrying large amounts of cash, he had also made large amounts of drug seizures, okay, and all that went into the city marshal's office. After it had been sent to the Texas DPS laboratory, crime laboratory, it was analyzed, weighed, and packaged, sealed with a unique sticker describing the amount and type of narcotics evidence that was. Those boxes were left behind. So that gave us some indication of what exactly was missing. And so we knew we were dealing with a large amount of narcotics.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. There's no guessing. You have a basic inventory of what was stolen.
That's exactly right. So at this point, it's pretty clear cut that we have McClure involved in this. One of the top priorities of the FBI is public corruption. It is the top criminal priority in the FBI, and probably I think overall the third priority behind maybe terrorism and cybercrime. I may have those wrong, but nonetheless, public corruption is a top priority in the FBI. And so clearly, it's nice that we have all this evidence against McClure, but we really wanted the city marshal here who's allowing this to happen. So we confronted McClure, and he essentially denied anything, but said he had been directed by Fred Walker to install illegal wiretapping equipment in Barry Washington's office and in the mayor's office in City Hall. He had installed hidden audio recorders, and he had installed hidden video cameras that were disguised as smoke detectors. And it was
what?
It was never actually determined, but my reasoned opinion is that this was something that Barry Washington was a thorn in the side of Fred Walker and Rod McClure, and that the wiretapping was an attempt to gather some kind of dirt on Washington to compromise him and get him out of there. But anyway, so McClure admitted to involvement in this illegal wiretapping, and he said that it had been done on the orders of Fred Walker. So, and then he admitted that he also had some of the recordings in his house. Well, at the time, we didn't take those recordings, but we went and got a search warrant for McClure's house a few days later. And when we executed the search warrant, we also found 13 guns. Now, part of McClure's criminal history included a firearms violation, or I'm sorry, a sexual assault violation that had a felony conviction with it. So he was a felon in possession of a firearm. And so he was arrested, McClure was arrested that day at his house. In the federal system, a person after they're arrested would have what's called an initial appearance before a U.S. magistrate. So on the way, I have to understand too, some more Texas geography. So McClure lived in Tenaha. The nearest jail that would accept federal prisoners was in Lufkin, Texas. But the nearest magistrate for an initial appearance was down in Beaumont, Texas, which is down near Houston. So after a night in the jail in Lufkin, McClure was transported to Beaumont for his initial appearance before a federal magistrate. During the course of this car ride, which was probably right at 2 hours or so, McClure initiated and gave a full confession about his involvement with Walker and with this ongoing theft of the narcotics, that they'd staged the burglary. Another interesting thing too, at the burglary that was staged, a letter was found that was written in Spanish, and roughly translated, it said, "We are the Los Zetas cartel. We are coming to Tenaha to kill all the law enforcement officers there." It was really very not well done. Okay, and it was one of the
believable, a little yeah. Over the top.
Yes, it was one of those things that just was at the time of that burglary, the Texas Rangers investigated it, and they thought it was a staged burglary. They thought something was fishy, but actually at the time couldn't prove it. So McClure admits to having a girlfriend write the letter, the Spanish letter for him. And it was done to basically make it look like that the Los Zetas had done this burglary. And so part of what they reasoned was, if we want to make this thing look real, you're not going to have a Mexican cartel break into an evidence room and just take the dope. There's also guns in here. It wouldn't be believable that they would leave the guns. So they took the guns and they threw them in a local creek. And so McClure is telling all this in his admission, but in the car. So the guns were subsequently recovered, which gave credence to his story. So when McClure appeared before the magistrate in the federal system during initial appearance, one is either detained pending trial, or the judge lets them go on their own recognizance. McClure was detained. The judge made the decision to detain McClure, and at that point, he really never cooperated again. Case, which was quite curious, and is really the mystery of the book, that how I end the book. But
well, let me ask you this question:
sure.
Mm-hmm. When he did talk to you during that 2-hour car ride mm-hmm. to Beaumont, was it because he was thinking he was going to make some type of deal so he would not have to be taken into custody?
I absolutely believe that is exactly what he was thinking. I don't think he counted on that he was going to be detained. And I think you're absolutely correct. I think he felt like that maybe he could get released and that he would be able to control and do things from there. And so when he was detained, it put a big crimp in his ability to control the situation. So from that moment on, he really never cooperated, and in fact went through a series of attorneys that he hired and fired. He filed numerous motions for various hearings. He fought tooth and nail for on every aspect of this case, and he lost at every turn. But nonetheless, it really dragged the case out. And ultimately our whole goal was to get Fred Walker. So let me backtrack on that a second. So Terrence Ford had the text messages from McClure. We could place that these photographs of the drugs were in McClure's house. We had the girlfriend who admitted that she had written a letter for him to stage this burglary. We had numerous pieces of direct evidence against McClure. But in the course of it, we didn't have anything on Fred Walker. Ford had never had any direct conversations with Walker about this scheme. He only knew what he knew through McClure. So we couldn't use him. That would have been hearsay. And there was no other direct evidence. Fred Walker hadn't sent any text messages, that incriminated himself. And so we actually needed McClure. We needed his testimony that Walker was part of it. We needed McClure, but he was not cooperating. He was fighting this case as hard as he could. Now, we also knew that he had been a DEA informant. He had admitted that to us. Checked with some of his former DEA handlers. They all remembered him, and they were all of the same agreement that he was an eager informant. He would inform on anybody. And so it didn't make sense as to why he would not cooperate against Walker, because he would have had it would have greatly helped his situation, because he was facing about 25 years on the narcotics charges that were hanging over him. But he never did. So through the course of all these hearings and motions and motions to dismiss and evidentiary suppression hearings, McClure ultimately came down to, we're going to be going to trial. Okay. So we were preparing and getting ready for trial when McClure said that, or through his attorney, wanted to have a proffer session. He wanted to provide us information. So we were thinking, well, maybe this is it. Maybe this is finally going to be it. He's going to finally give us what we need against Fred, and certainly we're going to need some cooperation, but maybe this is what we needed. Well, that was not what occurred at all, because in the proffer session, all McClure did was essentially go down our witness list and provide dirt. He provided dirt, or said some inflammatory statements about almost all of our witnesses that would impinge on their credibility, and that he knew, but provided absolutely nothing about Fred Walker.
So it's very self-serving proffer.
Oh, big time. Okay. But during the course of this proffer, he provided two pieces of information that were really very important and explained a lot to me. One was, he admitted that he was the source of the CNN report that initially started the national media sensation in the city of Tenaha, that the motorist that began the civil rights case, and that he felt that Barry Washington had been violating folks' civil rights, and that he felt as a good citizen that was his duty to report that. And although that's what he said, I really didn't believe that. I really believe it was the same pattern. It was just something he had done to try to get rid of Barry Washington. Because you have to understand, as this civil rights case was going on, as Barry Washington was doing these narcotics stops, these interdiction stops, Rod McClure and Fred Walker were selling the seized drugs almost as quickly as Barry Washington brought it in.
Wow.
So, but nonetheless, even though Barry was bringing in a lot of stuff, he also they had to work around him. So he was kind of a thorn in their side. So I believe that contacting CNN was his attempt to just put pressure on Barry so that Barry would resign and leave.
Well, that must have given you some type of relief in your investigative skills, because I'm sure you were still questioning how these allegations came in about these, civil rights illegal car stops, that you weren't able to find any evidence. And the reason was because it was all a bogus charge, a bogus allegation.
Absolutely. And it really was a great relief, and it actually it made a lot of sense. And so the other thing that McClure offered in this proffer was that he wanted to clear the air about something. He wanted it known that he was not a murderer, and that he, quote, didn't do murder because that could put a needle in your arm. And what he was referring to were rumors that we had heard during the course of this investigation, but we had not really looked into, that a person named David Thompson, who had died of an apparent suicide, had actually been murdered. And Rod wanted it known on the record that he didn't do it. But he was happy to offer who he thought did it, and it was one of our witnesses that we were going to use against him in the narcotics case. So at this point, we had a new issue to kind of deal with. We have a guy.
You can't ignore that. Yeah, you can't ignore that.
We have a guy making an allegation that one of our witnesses possibly murdered a guy. So a little background on David Thompson. David Thompson was a friend of Rod McClure's. They had worked together at this small Tenaha city water department, and it was reputed that David Thompson was a drug dealer. In fact, McClure told us that Thompson had taught McClure how to cook methamphetamine, had shown him how to convert a semi-automatic rifle into a fully automatic, and had passed along several other skills. But one of the other skills that apparently David Thompson had was downloading child pornography. And the Secret Service, actually, unrelated to the civil rights case, unrelated to our narcotics investigation, had actually, David Thompson had become a suspect of theirs in a child pornography case. And they had, the Secret Service ended up doing a search warrant at David Thompson's house on a Thursday afternoon. Thompson admitted to having the child pornography. His computers were seized, which all had been set up by Rod McClure, by the way, and were in McClure's name. That was on a Thursday. Thompson, who was actually homebound at this time and visited by home health care nurses, was found dead the next Monday of a gunshot wound to the head. Now, the only person to officially investigate this matter was Fred Walker. There were no crime scene photos available. There was I think maybe a 3-paragraph report on this apparent suicide. Most of it was spent describing what actions Walker took to ensure that there was no civil liability on him for having to break into the house when the home health care nurse had knocked and there was no answer. Another interesting thing is that Walker, before he entered the house, insisted that a home health care nurse go in with him at the same time. And when they went in, they found David Thompson on a bed. Clearly, he was deceased. And that's pretty much it. That's how the case ended, or that's the investigation of David Thompson. So we set about with contacting and interviewing the home health care folks that were present during that. And one of the curious things was Thompson was found on a bed that was, the head of the bed was in a corner of the room. Okay. It was all up flush against the corner of the room. He was laying on it would be on the right edge of the bed, on his back with his left arm dangling off the bed, And the gun apparently, well, it wasn't apparently, I mean, the gun was under the bed, slightly under the bed near his left hand, which was dangling off the bed. However, the gunshot was in his right temple. It would be very, very difficult for him to shoot himself with his left hand. The guy was 5'7" and he weighed about 275. So I don't think he had much flexibility. And it was just a very strange arrangement for how it would be. You would think that he would be found, because go ahead.
I was going to say, and this is from the home health care nurse, because you had no crime scene photos. That's
correct. So it was a home health care nurse, a person from the funeral home, and the county judge. Justice of the peace, who all described Thompson being on his back, left arm dangling, gun under the bed, and gunshot wound to the right side of the head. So what I surmised we were dealing with was a staged crime scene, whereas where we've seen one before at the city marshal's office before. David Thompson, we presume, would have known all about McClure's narcotics trafficking and so forth. So there never was enough evidence that McClure or Walker actually killed him, but it was suspicious and remains unsolved to this day. So McClure was trying to tell you that one of your witnesses did it. That's correct. And McClure said that once the Secret Service had shown up, that they had taken his computers, that the other witness was scared to death that Thompson was going to cooperate with the Secret Service and tell what he knew about all the drug trafficking in town. McClure said he was not concerned that Thompson would tell on him, but he said our witness was. Now, Thompson never did cooperate. He didn't provide anything at all, but if he was killed, someone was scared that he was going to, I believe. So that the case ultimately kind of ends anticlimactically, because Fred Walker was never charged in the narcotics trafficking because McClure never cooperated against him and actually remains a free man. Are you serious? The U.S. Attorney's Office made the decision that all we had was circumstantial evidence against Walker, and that it was a roll of the dice if we went to trial to try to convict him. And they made the decision to just leave him as an unindicted co-conspirator. And so what happened with Rod McClure? Did he go to trial, or did he McClure ended up pleading guilty. And that doesn't make any sense to me. So if you're going to plead anyway, why wouldn't you cooperate and provide information to your co-conspirator? Part of what we learned along the way through jail recordings was that McClure claimed that he had been promised at least $40,000 to keep his mouth shut. And I guess he reasoned that doing 56 months in jail was worth $40,000. I don't really know what the thought process was, but it just is kind of left as a mystery. Amazing. I had no idea that is how this was going to end. So how did you feel about that? Well, one of the questions that you might think about, and you had brought it up earlier, is why in the world did Walker, knowing that the Jack Frost letter described their narcotic scheme, why did he send that? And I honestly don't have an answer for you other than my own opinion, my own speculation. And you have to understand that when they staged the burglary of the marshal's office to cover up the theft of the drugs, there had been that had remained unsolved. And I think they arrogantly believed that they had done such a great job of staging the burglary that just nothing's going to come back on them. So what do they have to worry about? And so so that's why the letter was sent.
Wow. That is absolutely amazing. Talking about a surprise ending.
Exactly. So in a way, there's some irony in the case in that, McClure had brought in the national media to try to hound, I think, Barry Washington out of town. And that really resulted in the FBI, the DOJ, the Texas Rangers, and the ATF ultimately all getting involved in this case, which actually kind of ended up kind of coming back on him and exposing what was really going on. And so it's funny how things work sometimes.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up question that
Sure.
I had, and that was the fact that you were saying that they made all of these stops, that they were able to confiscate all these drugs and money, and they were all in the storeroom there at the city marshal's evidence room, but that the local prosecutor, the local district attorney, never attempted to actually charge or prosecute any of these people driving through town. Why was that? Was it just because it was just there for a money-making revenue source, and they really didn't care about the illegal activity?
I never knew the real reason as to why folks, those car stops were not followed up with prosecutions. I really don't know, because it really gave just an awful appearance to what was going on. I don't know if it just was something that maybe it's a small office, a small county, and maybe they were just overwhelmed and just, were not able to get to them in a timely manner. I really don't know. Maybe it was incompetence. I don't know. I really don't have an answer for you there, but it certainly, I think, would have short-circuited a lot of the allegations that anything wrong was happening.
Well, we've talked now for an hour, and you've told us some absolutely fascinating stories and twists and turns, but I would imagine that in your book, and again it's called Tenaha, Corruption and Cover-Up in a Small Town in Texas, I would imagine that there is so much more to the story that we didn't get a chance to talk about.
There is. I go into great detail about the crime scene where David Thompson was, and there's a lot more to it in between. You're exactly right.
All right. Well, I will make sure that I put a link to your book in this episode's show notes, and I will also include it in my FBI reading resource, which is a list I keep of all of the crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs written by the very agents that I've interviewed on this podcast. And I encourage, everyone listening that if you want to learn more about this case, that they need to go and pick up a copy of Tenaha, Corruption and Cover-Up in Small Town, Texas. So, could you tell us a little bit about you, Stewart? I mean, where were you assigned when you were in the FBI?
Okay.
When did you join the FBI? Why did you join the FBI?
Sure. Okay. I go into this as well in the book a little bit. My grandfather had been an FBI special agent from 1941 to 1962.
Wow.
And he actually, I have a vague memory of him. He died really before I really ever got to know him that well. So I really never got any firsthand stories of the FBI from him, but I just kind of knew in the back of my mind that he had been an FBI agent, and I always thought that was kind of a really cool thing. And I really didn't set out to be an FBI agent, but I pursued a degree in accounting. I got a degree in accounting, and then I learned that the FBI hired lawyers and accountants. That was primarily who they looked for in those days. So in 1987, I joined the FBI. I started out as a support employee, and then shortly after that, I became an agent, and I was assigned to the Little Rock office as my first office. From there, I went to Chicago, and then in 1997, I got transferred to the Tyler Resident Agency, which is a small satellite office out of the Dallas office, the Dallas Steel Division. And when I got to Tyler, I primarily worked public corruption matters. That was what I mainly worked, which ended up being, sadly, mainly law enforcement corruption in the form of officers protecting drug dealers. So I had seen quite a few of those cases, but when this Tenaha case happened, it had a lot of different aspects that I had not seen prior.
Yeah, it really had. It had like so many different violations. So, what are you doing now?
Well, I retired in December of 2016, last December, and I've got all my licenses and certifications as a private investigator in Texas. But since that time, I've actually had to spend practically my full-time efforts now are being a caretaker for an aunt of mine I'm her only living relative. And I will say this, that the most dangerous, the most complicated case that I would have worked in the FBI was a cakewalk comparing to dealing with elder care issues. So I'm on new uncharted waters in that regard. But my aunt is steadily improving, and hopefully I will soon be able to get back and start doing some private investigation work.
Wow, what a great nephew you are. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. So I always like to give my guest the last word. So you can sum up this case or talk about your career. What would you like to say?
Well, as far as this case, it's something that, at least the book, I never really set out to be a writer. I actually enjoy writing. I enjoy the process, and I'll have to say it actually comes fairly easy to me. But that was really not why I wrote the book. As I began to close out the case, one of the things that we typically do is just a summary of the case to close it out. And as I started writing this closing summary, it occurred to me, I was reminded that over the course of this investigation, several times people had told me, this case is so unique. There's so many little twists in it. It really deserves, someone should write a book about this, because no one would really believe all this. And as I started writing that closing summary, that's what occurred to me, that well, maybe there is a book in this, and maybe someone should hear about this. And so that's how that got started. And I actually have a second book that I'm writing now that kind of set me on a new career path that I really didn't see coming. So I'm enjoying it so far, and it's really been fun. And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Stewart Fillmore. You'll find links to newspaper articles about the case, and you'll find a link to his book, Tenaha, Corruption and Cover-Up in Small Town, Texas. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, of course, you can share it directly from your device. And if you're listening to it from my website, look at the bottom of the show notes. The social media buttons are back. All right, so my crime fiction recommendation is And When She Was Good, a novel by Laura Lippman. The novel is about Heloise, a woman with a secret life who, with no formal education, no real family or friends, has been able to support herself and her son as a suburban madam. When she learns that her son's father, a killer, and her former pimp might be released from jail, she's desperate to disappear and remake her life again. Now, I have to confess that I listened to this as an audiobook, and I really enjoyed the novel, but I wonder if I would have enjoyed it as much if I had read it instead of listened to it, because there is a lot of prose and not a lot of action and dialogue, but I really love the introspective viewpoints from the different characters. So yes, I recommend And When She Was Good by Laura Lippman. And while you're over at Amazon.com taking a look at When She Was Good,
I hope you also check out my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. The book is available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. And I want to remind you, I still have a few promo codes which are good for a free copy of the Pay to Play audiobook. They're first come, first serve. So if you're thinking that this sounds like a book that you might like, then just email me, let me know, and I'll send you out that promo code so you can get a free copy of Pay to Play. All I would ask is if you do enjoy listening to the crime thriller, that you leave a review at audible.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.